All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Palos Verdes Land Conservancy December 2007 walk. We will be walking McBride Trail, and thank you also for coming very much. I know everybody's busy doing Christmassy things and writing cards and so forth, and we very much appreciate that you're taking the time to actually come out and walk with us. So let's just see that we get down the hill, and maybe there's a little bit more of a wind shelter. We have quite a cold day today, but it's sunny, so that's at least something. All right, we stopped here because there's quite a bit of native California habitat here. And later on during the walk, it is not as visible. It's more down the canyon, so we can look at this. We actually have right here, fresh and green and vining like crazy, what is called a man root. How many of you have been on these walks before? Oh, okay. So you just have to bear with us. And the more you come, the more you're going to learn the plants, and you're going to all be experts and can be walk leaders. This man root right here, which looks sort of like a grapevine, is a California native, and the reason it is called man root is because they have huge bulbous roots that look sort of like a potato. You know how potatoes are brown and scaly on the outside? It's like that. If you dug it out, and it can get huge. And that's one of the reasons that this plant can, as soon as the first rains comes, this plant just explodes and crawls all over anything that's near. It's not a parasite. It doesn't bother anything, and very quickly into the spring, it will die and just be very benign, just sort of hang in the bushes brown. It gets sort of a papery fruit later on, and those of you that have been here, and those of the audience that hike with us or without us, have seen them. They're sort of this size, very papery with spines on it, and when they really dry, inside are some large brown seeds. It's covering a Artemisia californica, which is the California sagebrush, and also the home and nesting place of the famous California gnatcatcher, which is a threatened bird, an endangered bird, and as it turns out, the peninsula has been fortunate to have its the amount increased dramatically, and that's one of the major reasons when you preserve open space, the birds and the animals will come. And from a very few pairs that were on the peninsula maybe like 20 years ago, we now have 76 pairs on the peninsula altogether in all the various parks and properties. So that's really very gratifying and quite wonderful. The other plant that is here also hiding a little bit is the ashy leaf buckwheat. It's also a very common plant, and all these plants, because we've had a little bit of rain, are beginning to immediately sprout out. As you know, we've had quite a drought, and they're not fully recovered yet, but as soon as they get a little bit of water, they tend to come back, also after fires. So we thought we'd stop here and talk about that, but we'll go on now. Another very prominent native bush in the coastal sage scrub habitat on the peninsula and elsewhere in the coastal sections of California is the lemonade berry bush, and as you can see, it has set all these little pink buds now. And of course, later, those of you that frequently walk or have been on our walks know that they get these little clusters of fruit later on in summer with a very sort of a glutinous covering. It's very, very tart, more so than lemon. And you can eat it if you ever run out of water. You can suck at them, but make sure you know what you're doing. Don't eat anything you're unsure about. But this lemonade berry bush is actually a relative of the mango and the pistachio. It's in that same family, so that's pretty interesting. And as you can see, it's always green. If you have an odd hill that needs covering with something that stays green all year long, the lemonade berry bush is your ticket. It's less flammable than some. For instance, the Artemisia that we just looked at is more flammable. If there is a big fire, a really big fire, there's nothing that will stop that anyway. People ask us and say, what can we plant that is fireproof? There's nothing fireproof, but there are some that are less flammable than others. And for instance, some California natives, particularly more in the mountains, that have resins and oils that burn very easily. So you wouldn't want to plant that next to a house. But other plants are not as flammable. While we're walking today, one of the major things on this walk today is the view. So always be sure to turn around and look and enjoy. This is an easy walk. We just stroll along and just enjoy the place that we live in. As you know, I don't have to tell you that we're in a fabulous place, and that's why we do these walks and show you maybe places that you haven't seen that you can then walk yourself. All right, we stopped here because we have started McBride Trail, and I will tell you and the audience on the television about McBride in a minute. But right now we're looking down on McCarroll Canyon. McCarroll was a farming family many years ago. And this canyon you might have read about in the paper. It had drainage problems, and that's McCarroll Canyon. Right. And we're looking down on an area that in 1994 was purchased by the city. These gentle three hills there, the Three Sisters, or the Barkentine property, was purchased by the city of RPV, one of the very first purchases. It was 94 acres, and the rest this way, and obviously this way, belongs to the developer, Mr. York. And he has chosen to put this fence up. But his property sort of meanders all over the place, and but what we're looking down on, and the camera may catch that, is Abalone Cove, which is of course a public park. The first peninsula out into the ocean is Portuguese Point. The next one is Inspiration Point. In between is a very sheltered cove called Sacred Cove, and we also take walks there. Then we look on and we see this plume of sort of dirt out there. That is when the ocean nibbles away on the cliffs and where the landslide comes in. So the continuous movement of the landslide, it still moves a little all the time, as you well know when you drive Palos Verdes Drive. And it goes seawards, of course, continuously. And then the ocean, of course, all along the California coast, from here down to Dana Point, erodes. It erodes a couple inches every year. The ocean will just keep nibbling away at it, and then this added slide, doesn't help. So that's what that dirt is, and of course the recent high waves that we had a couple of days ago from these northern storms made that obviously worse. We are also looking, while we're standing here, the Bear property was just sort of like two bigger trees, and then there's a lot of woods after that. That is an area that Mr. York is trying to develop. It's part of his land. It's about 90 acres or so, and he does have plans in front of the city to put 84 homes there. The Conservancy and the city are still hoping perhaps one day we can buy that. In the meantime, of course, we've been extremely proud of having purchased last year Portuguese Bend in general. And we always talk about like the Portuguese Bend Bowl, which actually goes all the way to Forestall. Those cliffs back there is just the other side of Forestall. And if this ever becomes one contiguous place, or area, it's going to be almost a 1,000-acre park. So it's really neat, and that of course has really been the aim of the Conservancy when it was founded, because this is the area that you see when you drive Palos Verdes Drive. You don't see Chandler, or you don't see Lunada Canyon, the other properties that the Conservancy managed to preserve. You see this, and when our founder Bill Ayler, I'm sure he saw this and said, hey, it's here by virtue of this landslide and being deemed not buildable, at least not very easily, perhaps it could be saved. And that's how it all started out in 1988. And now we're almost there. So it's really a huge, huge accomplishment, yes. All right, and another little stop. Actually, a whole bunch of non-native stuff here in front of us. Tumbleweed. It's also called Russian thistle. And those of you that have been with us know that. It is suspected that it was imported from Russia. Actually, it's a Russian weed, and they think it is thought that it was in the bedding of immigrants, because you remember, in the 1800s and so forth, people had, or even afterwards, they had straw in their mattresses, and you didn't need to clean that particularly. You just sort of stuck it in, and if there were seeds in there, you wouldn't know, and so it spread very quickly all over the United States. And in spite of its romantic connotations about cowboys and tumbleweed and all that good stuff, it's really a very noxious weed. And we try to get rid of it. And it's one of those weeds that we take out. And what happens is, just about this stage, when it's ripe, it will detach from its root, and the root base is actually very thin. You've seen it tumble, it's this ball, and then there's a little bitty sort of root on the bottom. Yeah. And there's a fungus that seems to, when the time comes, detaches this, it gets loose, and as it tumbles along, it releases all its seeds. And that's why it spreads so far.
There were a couple last night along Crenshaw.
Yeah, I bet you. And often they're huge. They're absolutely huge. And again, an invasive weed that has managed, because it has so many seeds, to really proliferate. And when people said, well, why do you get rid of these things? That's one of the reasons. And as you can see, if it's really thick, like so many other invasive species, it crowds out the natives, and we don't want that. Okay, that's why. I mean, if it's one single plant, you say, okay, it's just sitting there doing nobody any harm, fine. But generally, non-native weeds or noxious weeds, poisonous weeds, tend to have prolific seeds, and that they spread all over the place and crowd out the natives. And the natives may be, for all we know, may be food for, again, native animals or birds and so forth. So it is important to take those out, and it's one of the big chores that the Conservancy has. And when we are asked to manage these properties, which of course for all these big properties, the city of RPV asks the Conservancy to manage it. That's what we do, and that's probably in the next 50 years or so is what we're going to mostly do, because the land is pretty well preserved, and they want somebody that has learned to be an expert. Wasn't an expert to begin with, but has learned to be an expert to manage it, and that's why we get, our name gets involved in all of this. We're also looking at another non-native, which is the tree tobacco. It's this tree thing there with the yellow blossoms on it, and we may see more, and we can look at it closely. It actually comes from Peru. And it is not quite known how it got here. Many of these things are obscure. But it can be, I guess the natives, or maybe the first colonists, they could smoke it if they couldn't find real tobacco. So I don't know how that would taste. It's also poisonous, so I don't know how they manage that. But it's a nicotina. It's the tobacco family, and the blossoms, the yellow tubular blossoms, are favored by hummingbirds. Next to it is actually a California native, or sort of a all-purpose world native, because it's actually from Mexico. It's the opuntia, or prickly pear cactus, but it has spread worldwide and is almost considered a native in many countries. All the Mediterranean countries have opuntia these days, or these centuries. It gets to the point where you just sort of claim it as your own, but originally it's from Mexico. Again, we're looking down, and you can see that in the canyons and sort of valleys that there is habitat. Right. Anything that was relatively flat and could be planted was farmed in the old days. Around the 1900s and before, it was farmed initially, and before that it was totally bald because it was major cattle grazing. And those of you that are interested in history, there's a lot of history here. This original ranch belonged to Juan Dominguez, who was a soldier in Portola's army. Portola was the Spanish soldier, or general in that case, who was sent to do an expedition to upper Northern California. He marched his army, or his men, how many he ever had, through the country, through San Marco Pass, Santa Ynez Valley, Salvang,